morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk to you today about a very important subject, and that's the two missing dimensions in cattle breeding. That's what we lack in terms of conventional cattle breeding and management. And one has to do with breeding, and the two missing dimensions in breeding are inherent body condition and hormonal balance. And in terms of management, is that we're not using the cattle to improve the land. In other words, we have to improve our grazing management by using the cattle to improve the land, and we also have to have our production cycle in terms of calving and breeding in sync with natural nutrition. Because if we don't do that, we just add our costs, and our production will be high, maybe high, but our profit per hectare will be very low. So it's very important that we have to understand what our goal is. Is our goal production per animal? Do we want to breed monstrous cattle that are the size of elephant? Do you want to breed cattle that are high performing but require better nutrition in order to perform? Or would we like a goal of maximum sustainable profit per hectare? In other words, maximum sustainable profit per hectare requires very different management and breeding management and breeding criteria than what is conventional management. So it's very important to understand that. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk from a perspective of a goal of maximum sustainable profit per hectare, and not production per animal. So the biggest paradigm shift we have to make as ranchers is to understand that we have to use cattle to improve the land and make us money, give us a return. And the management requirements are very different in terms of doing that versus conventional management. So it's very important to make that paradigm shift from production per animal to sustainable profit per hectare. So first, there are two things we have to understand that are very important. Cattle have a dual role. Cattle have to be efficient grass converters. In other words, we have to breed and manage them in order to convert grass very efficiently into a product that we sell, in this case beef. That is very important. The second one is that we have to use cattle to improve the land. In other words, we can't manage them as we are currently managing under conventional management. We have to do it very differently. So land improvement, I've got a slide here showing the difference, what happens if you manage cattle differently. In other words, if you manage them at very high densities where they impact the land heavily and you graze non-selectively, you can increase your production from the land. You can double it or quadruple it within a year. Unless you're in a very degraded environment, in some parts of the world where you have a degraded environment due to your climate being arid, there the production can be much higher than what it is currently, because you are going to use cattle to improve the land, increase the effectiveness of your rainfall, improve soil fertility, etc. I have a graph here which shows the importance of stocking rate. We don't understand the importance of stocking rate because conventionally we opt for low stocking rates so the cattle can graze selectively, because that's the only way in conventional management that we can achieve a high production per animal. Allow the animals to graze the nutritious grasses and leave the less palatable grasses. But if we do it differently, we can increase our stocking rate. And stocking rate, the number of animals you have on a piece of land, is by far the most important determinant of profit, more than any other attribute that the cattle have. The second, the most important trait that cattle require is high fertility. So a combination of high fertility and high stocking rate will give you maximum return on a piece of land. Unless, of course, the professors at universities can help us achieve twinning in our cattle, which is impossible. So in terms of breeding, inherent body condition and hormonal balance are the missing dimensions. And in terms of current conventional breeding, where we select for size and we select for growth rate, we indirectly lower inherent body condition, and we breed animals with a poorer hormonal balance. When I talk about hormonal balance, it's a balance between growth and sex hormones. So if you overemphasize size and growth, you'll have a reduction in sex hormones, testosterone in the bull and estrogen in the cow, and that leads to lower fertility. So it's very important that we implement breeding that allow us to achieve high inherent body condition and a good hormonal balance. In terms of inherent body condition, it's very simple. Inherent body condition is determined by 4 factors. One is the size of the animal. If you look at all the mammals in the world, and I'm asking you the question now, all the mammals in the world, the largest mammal in the world is an elephant. One of the smaller animals in the world is a mouse. which animal has got the highest intake, takes the most feed in per day? Obviously the elephant. But if you look at the size of the animal, and we're talking about relative intake relative to size, which animal has got the highest relative intake? An elephant taking in 100 kilograms of grass or forage a day, and he weighs a couple of tons, or a mouse that's got a lower intake, but a much higher intake relative to its size. So that's the difference between absolute intake and relative intake. So the smaller the animal, in between, if we look at mammals in the world, even between species of cattle and sheep, sheep have a much higher intake than cattle, much higher relative intake. That's why they have a faster metabolism. That's why they have a shorter gestation period. They have a higher fertility rate because of that. But within a herd of cattle, exactly the same principle applies. If you look at your cattle, any herd of cattle, your larger framed cattle, your largest cattle, will always be in poorer body condition than your smaller framed cattle. And that's because of intake, relative intake. If you look at the difference between let's say, for argument's sake, a 300 kilogram cow, another cow that's twice the size, 600 kilogram. The intake of a 600 kilogram cow is 67% higher than that of a 300 kilogram cow on average. But the relative intake, in other words, intake relative to size, for the smaller cow is much higher. It's 20% higher. So that relates to 20% better body condition. So size is very important. And conventionally, we're breeding cattle to be too big because you're looking at absolute size in terms of absolute growth rate and size. So we have to increase the nutrition by feeding them more or by lowering the stocking rate and allowing them to graze selectively. That's the one thing. The other thing that impacts on intake, relative intake, is adaptation, climatic adaptation. If you, all over the world, there are places in the world that I've been to where cattle are in hot environments and they're not adapted to a hot environment. Like cattle that have overheat, they will stop eating and have a lower intake. So that impacts negatively on the absolute intake and also the relative intake. And thirdly is the resistance to parasites and diseases. African cattle, for instance, in our African environment are very adapted and very resistant to parasites, diseases, ticks, internal parasites, and they will always have a higher intake than the European counterparts that you might find here in Africa. So that's very important. And the fourth one, which a lot of people don't understand, is that individually, some animals just have a higher intake. Some animals, like some of us, just eat much more than others. And those are the animals you want. You want an animal that's relatively small frame, so it's got a high intake, relative intake. It's climatically adapted, resistant to parasites and diseases, and it has an ability to forage more aggressively. It'll eat longer and eat more aggressively. So by the end of the day, it's taken in much more forage, regardless of its size or climatic adaptation. So that is what we require. And then hormonal balance is very important. That's one of the missing dimensions. It's a balance between growth and sex hormones. It's important to understand that when an animal, whether it's a bull or a heifer, starts reaching sexual maturity, or it reaches sexual maturity when the growth hormones decrease proportion to the sex hormones. In other words, if an animal reaches sexual maturity at a younger age, it will always be a smaller frame because there's less influence of growth hormones. But if we're selecting for growth, we're indirectly selecting for poorer sexual maturity and a lower estrogen level in cows and a lower testosterone level in bulls. So it's very important to understand that, because if we don't understand that and we select, as we currently do conventionally, we select cattle that are out of tune in terms of their body condition with the environment, also because of hormone imbalance of hormones. And then I show slides here that exactly show what happens when you castrate bulls at a young age or at an older age, or don't castrate them at all. So if a bull's not castrated, it stops growing in terms of his height. If he's castrated like an ox that pulls a wagon, he's much taller and he keeps on growing for the rest of his life because he doesn't have testosterone to stop his growth. So if you have a bull that's hormone imbalanced, he will also grow much taller than he would normally grow. The other thing that's important, I talked about earlier, that when an animal reaches sexual maturity, it stops growing in terms of height. So when an animal is mature, particularly a bull, you can judge whether he matures sexually early by looking at his height relative to his length. So a bull that matures early will have a very long, sausage-like body because his height stops growing, but his body length doesn't stop growing. So you'll have that. That's an indication of very early sexual maturity in a bull. And then, of course, another thing that is modified by hormones is fat and muscle. You get African breeds that have got good inherent body condition. You have cows that have got a lot of fat on them. But the bull will be in good body condition, but he'll have no lumps of fat on him. He's got more muscle on him. And that's just, the genetics is exactly the same. It's just modified by the hormones. So testosterone will emphasize muscling, and estrogen will emphasize fat. It's very important to understand this when you look at cattle, because a lot of people don't understand it, and they will select for fat in a bull. If you select directly for fat in a bull, you'll get a hormonal imbalance. If you select for muscle in a cow, you'll get a hormonal imbalance. So we mustn't select directly for fat or muscle. We must select for the whole, which includes that, and it includes the hormones as well. So then you'll have an animal that's ideal. So what is a good beef animal? I say our best cattle that we have in the world, and I've traveled around a lot, the best cattle are the ones that we would call unimproved. In other words, that the animals that man hasn't had too much of a hand in selecting. In other words, the animals that are naturally selected. So the best genetics we have in the world are from the unimproved breeds. In terms of the tropical world, naturally selected animals in Africa are African breeds. And it's very saddening to see that people don't understand that. Even in Africa, they don't understand it. In Africa, they will try and bring animals from Europe to try and improve the African breeds. That's not the case. The unimproved breeds we will need to improve the so-called improved breeds. So it's very important to understand that the best animals we have are in the unselected, naturally selected animals, African breeds, and also your criollo breeds in Latin America, which would be the equivalent of the African breeds that haven't been selected by man, that have developed under natural selection. Because what happens under natural selection, you get a high inherent body condition, because it's the only way they can survive. What constitutes a good beef animal? One is high inherent body condition, and that's determined by, it's also a reflection on efficient grass conversion. Very important. And body condition is determined by relative intake. And hormonal balance is very important. Those are two foundations that we have to use when we select cattle. That's a foundation. The third one is optimum milk. We don't want a dairy cow grazing on dry grass. So we need optimum milk. So for a beef cow, optimum milk would be about 40 to 50% calf-cow weaning weight ratio. And then we need a high meat to bone ratio. I think in terms of carcass quality or carcass dressing percentage, the lower the bone percentage is relative to meat, the higher the percentage of meat is. So that's all we require. We don't require anything else apart from easy care. Easy care would be animals that you can basically put out on the grazing and they look after themselves, basically. They've got maternal instincts, they look after their calves, they're parasite disease resistant, they don't have a problem with climate, with rainfall, with temperature. Those are easy care cattle, those attributes. But they are inherent in naturally selected animals. African breeds in particular, and the criollo breeds in Latin America. So if we looked at the energy required for growth in terms of size and growth rate, there's a big difference between size and required growth rate in terms of energy required. It's very important to understand this. So the conclusion we can come to when we look at that is that if we're comparing a small animal with a large animal, the small animal under exactly the same conditions will be more efficient. So even at a lower growth rate, the small animal is more efficient. What it amounts to is that your smaller frame animals have an unfair advantage. And that unfair advantage is that they have a higher intake. So a larger animal has to grow faster in relative terms, in proportion, than a smaller animal to be equally efficient. But it can't eat more. So although it has to grow in proportion to its size, it cannot eat in proportion to its size. So genetically, large-framed animals are handicapped because they can't eat more. It's a biological fact. In terms of their relative intake, they can't eat more. So your smaller frame animals have always have an unfair advantage, if we can put it that way. And there's a difference. I talk about practical fertility and academic fertility. There are two determinants of fertility. One is hormonal balance and one is body condition, inherent body condition. So you can have an animal that's hormonally balanced like you get in many breeds, but they have a higher energy requirement in terms of nutrition because they have a low inherent body condition. So appropriate selection criteria, first, instead of growth rate, maturity rate. And what does that mean? How do we determine maturity rate? Maturity rate, if we had to select bulls, if we've got contemporary bulls same age, the ones that got the fullest package. So just by visually looking at an animal, we can determine which is the earlier maturing animal. And that relates to sexual maturity and also to grass conversion efficiency. If you had to be more accurate, you could do it by measuring hip height relative to size at a certain age. So if you've got the 12-month weights, you look at the hip heights of the different animals, the one with a heavier weight relative to his height is a more mature animal, a more efficient animal. So it's very simple to do that. But visually, most cattlemen can do it visually. So selecting for that full package is very important. Secondly, practical fertility is very important. If you've done a degree at university, agricultural animal science degree, they will tell you that fertility is lowly irritable, very lowly irritable. Lowly irritable means that whether a cow is fertile or not, a cow calves every year or not, that is what they say, not what I say. That's what the textbook says. It's basically nutrition. 10% breeding and 90% nutrition. But that's not true. How can fertility, which is a survival trait, be lowly irritable? The problem with measuring fertility is where the problem arises. How do we measure fertility? So if we measure fertility where it's basically determined by environmental conditions, then the heritability of that will be low. But if we have a measurement criteria that we measure and that measurement reflects genetic variation to a large degree, then that measurement will be highly heritable. And we have a means to do that. So fertility has to be highly heritable. If you're a cattleman, you will know that in your herd, there's some cows that calve every single year. They're always fertile. And their progeny will always be fertile. So you've got families that are fertile. So if you have families that are fertile, then surely it must be genetically highly heritable, which is the case. Most people, ranchers calve just before the rainy season, in seasonal rainfall environments. They calve before the rainy season. 2 months or 6 weeks before the rainy season, that's when they want the cows to be calving. This time of the year, September, in this part of the world. Now, how do you reconcile that? When a cow is calving, her nutrition requirements are highest because she's producing milk and she has to keep her body condition up to reconceive. Now, if she's calving this time of the year, how do you reconcile that? Now, instead of calving in September, our rains start in the middle of November. So if you're calving in January, those cows will be calving on green grass. So they'll be much better body condition. So if we looked at intercalving period, for instance, intercalving periods is a period between different calves. That's a measure of fertility. If we looked at intercalving period, and we looked at a cow calving in September, and we looked at one calving in January, could we compare those two cows in terms of genetic fertility? No, because the cow calving in September calves in very poor conditions. Cow calving in January calves in very good conditions. And the one calving in December would be better than in September, and October, November will still be better than September. So we cannot compare cows over that period in terms of intercalving period. So that measure of fertility is very lowly heritable. But if we had all our cows calving in January and February over a 6-week period, 42 days, then it's easy to compare those cows because we just use intercalving period. Because the difference there will not be environmental because the environment is exactly the same. They calve at exactly the same time, same conditions, basically the same body condition in terms of management. So the differences in terms of body condition and hormonal balance will be the genetic, and that will be reflected in the intercalving period. So if we do that, we can select for fertility. So we have a group of cows that can do that calve at an early age, 2 years, and at 3 years again, and we select our bulls from those cows. We can start selecting for fertility. But a very important attribute in terms of bull selection, apart from hormonal balance, which comes from the cow to a certain degree, is inherent body condition. So we can have a bull that comes from a cow with high inherent body condition, but he might have been side by a bull with poor body condition. So that individual bull has to be determined in terms of his body condition, maturity rate. And we can do that by assessing the fullness of the package or the hip height relative to the weight at 12 months. So the fuller packaged animal is the one that's early maturing. the better ones. So that's important in bulls, not cows, because heifers, we don't do that. Heifers, we put them to the bull as yearlings, the ones that conceive and reconceive are the most fertile. But with a bull, we have to emphasize early sexual maturity, which we'll do later through breeding, but also inherent body condition. So once you've determined that, those bulls can go into a multi-siring situation as yearlings, with the counterpart heifers as yearlings. So if you've got 100 heifers and you've got 10 bulls that are multi-sire, and then you can determine which bull out of the 10 bulls is giving you the most calves. And he's the most fertile bull. And you use that bull, you collect semen from that bull, and you use them on your herd for 1 year. And you keep repeating the process all the time. And by doing that, you will select for fertility and you'll end up with a highly fertile herd of cattle. Just to give an indication in the southern hemisphere, I've got results here from northern Zimbabwe, which is in the southern hemisphere. Our rains start in the middle of November. The average period from calving to the first heat cycle in cows calving in September is 135 days. So 135 days for September. That same cow calving in January will be 40 days. So that's a very, very big difference. So we have to change our breeding seasons to coincide with the best nutrition. And if we do that, we only need a 42-day breeding season. So optimum milk, I mentioned that earlier, more or less 50% of calf to cow weight would be optimum. Much more than that, then you will need dairy nutrition for your cows to be able to reconceive. And then high meat to bone ratio is extremely important. It's extremely important from an economic point of view in terms of carcass, but also it reflects better grass conversion efficiency. Because the animal that's a better grass converter will be a better body condition and a fuller body as well. And high meat to bone ratio also reflects both hormonal balance and inherent body condition. So your best bull would never be your biggest bull. It'd be your shorter bull, stockier, smaller frame, but very stocky. So he's grown fast relative to his size. He matures early because of sexual maturity, higher testosterone, so that will also limit his size. And easy care is very important. Temperament is one. You want animals with a good temperament. You need animals that have calving ease. You don't want to have problems with calving. You have to have good mothering ability and also overall adaptation, resistance to parasites, diseases, etc. Easy care animals. So generally speaking, the herds around the world lack a lot in terms of hormonal balance and inherent body condition. And the quickest way to change that in any herd is to introduce other blood. If you introduce unimproved blood in terms of naturally selected animals, like your African breeds or your Creole breeds that are selected, and you introduce them to the current breeds that we have, then over a period of time we'll be able to breed a composite that suits your environment, suits your particular conditions, much quicker than any other way. It's the only way. So composite breeding for me is very important. And in terms of composite breeding, we have to look at the unimproved breeds to infuse. In other words, your African breeds, some of your Asian breeds maybe, and also your Creole breeds in Latin America. Those are the breeds that we require to improve the so-called improved breeds. It's the unimproved breeds. Secondly, that also important is that in those, if you're going to select an African breed bull or a Creole breed, it's also important that you select the right individuals, because there's a lot of variation in all these breeds. So you get an African breed like a Mashona, some will be well muscled and some will be poorly muscled. So it's very important to select the right breeds, but also the right individuals within those breeds. And then the most important after that is you close your herd and you select from within your herd. If you find that you've got enough of the introduced blood that you require, you close your herd and you breed your own bulls. So it'll be half brother and half sister forever. And doing it that way, your inbreeding coefficient is low, so you won't have inbreeding problems because you only use a bull for 1 or 2 seasons and then you replace him by his son. By doing that, you're infusing all the desirable genes if you select correctly and you use the right selection criteria. If you use a conventional selection criteria, you end up at the wrong endpoint. So we need to use the right selection criteria as well. Now the question might come up that you can't use crossbred bulls. When you form your own composite, you will obviously start with using bulls that come from different breeds. Now, generally speaking, most cattle ranchers and cattle breeders and cattlemen, academics, will recognize that crossbred cow is a very good cow. Everyone, no one argues that. But a lot of people say crossbred bull is not good. He doesn't breed poor. There's no sense in making that statement. In fact, if you have a bit of practical knowledge and you've done it yourself, you'll understand that if you select correctly, crossbred bulls will breed better than purebred bulls. So that's one of the myths we have to get rid of, is that a crossbred bull doesn't breed true. I've done the breeding side, now I'm going more into the management. The missing dimensions in terms of management are time-controlled, non-selective grazing and high animal impact. That's one of them. So we have to mimic nature by doing that. Second one is that we have to calve, breed and wean during a period that's best nutrition in our conditions. In other words, we're not calving before the rains, we calve with the rains. We breed with the rains on green grass, and preferably wean at the end of the green grazing period. So we have that window of opportunity. We calve, breed and wean during best nutrition. And then another important factor is that we have to enhance cattle ruminants. If you think of that dry grass that they convert out there into very high quality meat. But it's not the animal itself that does that, the digesting of the grass. It's microbes in the rumen, bacteria. So we have to feed those microbes so they have all the nutrients they require. On dry grass, we need to give some protein supplementation to allow the rumen bacteria to be able to convert that grass into something that the animal can digest. So that's important. So those three factors are very important. So we have to mimic nature. I've got a slide here on the Lua Plains in western Zambia. We have a wildebeest herd of hundreds of thousands of animals moving around. Why do they do that? In nature, you've got predators like lion and hyena. And if you were a buffalo or a wildebeest, where would you feel safest? And the largest herd there is right in the middle of that herd. So what predators do, keep animals bunched together, and they move around. They bunch together like at the dung and urinate, they trample, they break up the soil surface, they contaminate the soil in terms of the grass quality, and the animals have to move. So automatically they're moving onto fresh grazing all the time. And they only come back when that grass is recovered. Those large herds will come back when the grass is recovered. But you will still have other animals grazing there all the time. So grasses in Africa in particular have developed in a situation where they need high impact and non-selective grazing, but they can also survive selective grazing over a short period of time. So it can still happen. But what is lacking is a high impact. These large herds, concentrated herds that break up the soil, that graze non-selectively, and they move on. So that is what we have to mimic. And currently we can only mimic that very effectively and very economically by using portable electric fences, or a combination of static electric fences with portable electric fences in between. And I've got a diagram here that shows how you do the control. Basically, you have strips 50 meters or 100 or 200 meters wide, that may be a kilometer or two long, and you have the animals in those strips, but you subdivide those strips with cross wires. So that is how you keep the density very high. So you might have 1,000, the equivalent of 100 animals on 1/10 of a hectare. That would be the equivalent to 1,000 animals a hectare. So that would be more or less the minimum stocking rate or stock density that you would require. In more humid environments with poor quality grazing, you'd have to go to a higher stocking rate, about 3,000 animals per hectare. That doesn't mean you have to have 3,000 cows per hectare, but you can have 300 cows on a 1/10 of a hectare. It would be the equivalent of a stock density of 3,000. So there's a difference between stocking rate and stock density. Stocking rate is the overall animals you have on a piece of land. Stock density is that density of animals at a particular time. And by doing that, you move them constantly. By constantly moving them, they're going into fresh grazing all the time. So the best way to utilize all your grass is to have as many animals on a small area for a short period of time, and then give that area an appropriate recovery time. And appropriate recovery time depends on your environment as well. If it's an arid environment, arid, dry, you will have a long recovery period, which might be months or years, 18 months maybe, 2 years, depending on where you are. If you're in a humid environment, like parts of Latin America and parts of Africa, then the appropriate recovery at certain times would be much quicker, shorter recovery. to allow better nutrition, because the longer you stay, the grass is allowed to grow in humid environments, the lower the quality becomes, the higher the fiber. So at certain times of the year, like when your cows are calving and they're breeding, they need higher requirements. So during those times, you might shorten the grazing period, the recovery period rather. So they come back earlier to an area that hasn't recovered totally, but very high quality. And those areas that you do graze intensively like that, you alternate between years. So it's very important to understand that. And another factor that would be important to understand, because body condition is a challenging factor under non-selective grazing. Another factor would be to allow your high requirement animals in small groups, like heifers, preferential grazing, they can graze ahead of the cows. The cows can come behind and do the work, do the managing, do the trampling and the non-selective grazing. But that high impact non-selective grazing, at least once in a short intervals, is essential. But those intervals depend on your environment, arid versus humid environments. One of the problems that we have to address, particularly in the more humid environments, is that selective grazing, where animals will selectively graze certain grasses, individual grasses and species, because they're allowed to graze at low densities. They will selectively graze. So in a humid environment like you would get in parts of Latin America and parts of Africa, you're only utilizing half your grass. By the end of the dry season, if it hasn't been burnt, you've still got half the grass left because you couldn't utilize it. So we have to have these high densities to be able to utilize that. And in those environments, you can double your stocking rate immediately. The biggest problem we have with this system of grazing is that we don't have enough cattle. And cattle you can't just go and pick up, you have to buy. So that is a challenge, but it's a nice challenge to have. So the other thing with what we do with animals' hooves, cattle have been created with hard hooves, not to compact the soil, but to break the soil. If you put them in an area for a long period of time and they travel, walk around and they graze, they will compact the soil. But if you put them in an area for a very short period of time, they have the opposite effect. They break up the soil surface and allow more water to go in, and they aerate the soil, and that's how you increase the fertility of the soil. So it becomes, it's just, you have to practice this to understand how beneficial it is. It's impossible to understand if you don't do it. In my property in Zimbabwe, where I had to leave my land, in 1 year I doubled my stocking rate. After 7 years, I quadrupled. In other words, after 7 years, I was carrying 4 times the number of cattle that I could carry prior to that. So it just shows what happens when you have the harmony between the cattle and the land. So as I said, the biggest challenge in non-selective grazing is body condition. The first one we have to address is the genotype, the type of animal we have. Second one is high density and frequent moves. So they're going into fresh grass all the time. If you had a feedlot and you put out feed on Monday for the whole week, the feed would become stale. By the end of the week, the cattle would be eating very little of that feed. But if you put out feed each hour, by the end of the week, they would have eaten much more. And that's what we're doing with cattle as well. Appropriate recovery period, we've mentioned that. In a humid environment, at certain times of the year, you would come back much quicker. 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks at the most. And production is synced with nutrition. In other words, you're calving on green grass, you're breeding on green grass, and you're weaning on green grass. That mitigates the drop in body condition. And then, of course, supplementation, where you require protein supplementation. Small amounts, but it just helps the bacteria to be able to digest the grass better. So it's very important to understand that. Okay, good afternoon. I'd just like to introduce you to a friend of mine, Ryan Carlson, who lives in central Zambia in Kabwe. Ryan has been doing ultra-high density grazing now for 4 or 5 years, and it's a very good opportunity to see on the ground how he's doing it and what the results are. So I'll leave it over to Ryan to introduce himself and to give a background of what he's been doing.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Johann, for coming out to see me again. Johann's come out to see me a couple of times since I've been doing ultra-high density grazing. We've actually done high density grazing for about 4.5 years now, and it's proving to be beneficial to just not only our ecosystem but our cattle as well. Going on to this system, we realized we were actually understocked severely. Carrying out ultra high density, we could almost immediately double our stocking rate. Because I started off smaller, I didn't have the cattle numbers, so we had to start in smaller areas. Since our numbers have increased, we've also found that our stocking rate and our general biomass has increased to carry that stocking rate. We've also begun changing the genetics of our cattle to a more African-based breed. So we're selecting sort of more for inherent body condition and hardier genetics rather than from the European breeds. With our high density, we're running anywhere from sort of 2,000 to 3,000 head per hectare density. Overall, we're probably running the one cow to 1.6 hectares in this felt. We find it'll most likely increase to, we'll probably get to one cow to 1 hectare in the near future, probably in about 3 years' time. Conventional will be 1 animal to 6 hectares in this area, just due to the woodland and the conventional sort of mindset. The introduction of the African genetics has allowed us to actually push to that stocking rate a lot quicker than if we'd have sort of pursued with European and conventional genetics. I started out, the first few months I only had 30 head, and then I got in up to 100, and then I moved straight onto this, purely because I had no infrastructure whatsoever. There's nothing. The only barbed wire is in balls that people have left behind because they couldn't basically take it away. So there was nothing. This was the most cost-effective method, and already I already knew that I wanted to go in like this, so I went straight in. It's probably the labor and also learning the system. That's probably the biggest challenge. The more cattle you have, generally find that it's a bit easier to get the whole process going. 30 head is just too small almost to get going. At this time of year it is a bit more challenging because it's so dry and you have an earthing problem. Most of these cattle are very used to this fence. At night they're in a fully electrified. My neighbor, who is literally, we are neighbors, he comes over here, he doesn't understand why are your cows eating so much, why are they browsing? Mine are not doing that. And I keep saying to him, you've got to actually get into you've got to make them non-selective, you've got to get into that non-selective mindset or that mode, and they do eat everything. So all of this is browsed completely, so that's 100% utilization on that. My neighbor's on 300, we're on the same size farms. He's on 300, I was just under 1,000, but yeah. In 5 years, he's been amazed at the change here, but he's still not taking the steps. Everything's got to pay and improve the land, yeah. Keep it sustainable. This is sustainable, that's not sustainable. We've electrified it. They do push through a little bit more now. Some become more of a problem than others, and those are the ones that we just push out the system. It is also a mindset change for them. Once they get in like this, their heads are down. As you can see, they're in there. They know there's no time just to sit around. They've got to eat or they go hungry. And they'll only go hungry for maybe a day or two, and then they're into the system. Even if you take them out of this and start herding them again, for the first few days they will graze. Their intake will look quite high, and after a while they realize we can be a lot more selective, and then they do start moving around a bit more. I'll stay with this because it's effectively, at the end of the day, it's going to grow me more grass, and that's what I want. I want more grass, better water cycles, better nutrient cycles, more sustainable, healthier ecosystem, hopefully healthier cattle at the end of the day. The most I've run in one herd is 700, and it didn't really cause any problems. The only thing is, in 700 there might be 10 animals that are sort of testing the areas, so unless your earthing is really good, you might have to put an extra guy. In the ones who've been here, it's about 85%. For the ones that have been here for about 4 years now, very high pregnancy rates. Yeah, I've also been moving their calving season as well. So unfortunately, most of them were calving in about September, and now I'm moving it to sort of December. So it does take a bit of time to adapt as well, yeah. We haven't grazed this this whole season, so you'll have a lot at this time of year, a lot of litter coming in, covering the soil, which is just exactly what we want. This will break down reasonably quickly. It is starting to break down a lot quicker. I think as we were talking about the biology, it's coming back, so it's starting to break down quicker. Whereas previously, I could see leaves from that weren't burnt even 3 or 4 years before. I mean, we've had no rain for seven months since late March. The dung beetles are back here already. I'd never seen a farm that was actually so dead, even though it was alive. And even these trees are starting to actually show a bit of promise. A lot of them have been dying, and I think that's purely the amount of water that's actually been infiltrating. Even though we're so close to the river, I remember coming here and there would just be sheet erosion. It was just all washing off. Now it's getting a lot better. That water's going in. I think also the cattle have brought in another dynamic. The grass is going to probably come through more so than trees. So we've tried to concentrate on where we've been grazing and bring that impact back, bring that non-selectivity back. And it is responding. I actually haven't dipped this herd for a year. I used to spot spray, and I've now stopped spot spraying, because when I say to them, go and spot spray, I'm not around, so they'll just decide, we'll spot spray the whole herd. And then I get my ticks back. We've actually literally stopped spot spraying. All we'll do, because we're moving all the time, if something does get sick, we'll know about it. We'll see, she'll be slowing down. Within an hour, we know she's sick and we'll inject her. Usually it just takes one injection and she's fine again. Very seldomly will we have to actually take her out of the herd. I haven't had to take anything out of the herd and sort of take her to the sick bay or something like that. Well, here there's so much control. If something gets sick, we'll know about it literally within an hour. If I say I've treated 10 cattle in the last 8 months, obviously rainy season we get a little bit more of a challenge, but again there's just more ticks, not necessarily more sick animals. It's incredible, and it's just the whole world's going against cattle at the moment, and they're probably the answer for the world's problems. They just need to be managed correctly.
To summarize, everything in cattle breeding and management, everything in cattle breeding and management revolves around body condition and hormonal balance. Every management and breeding decision we make influences body condition. So everything is about body condition and hormonal balance. And another thing about body condition, it's a reflection of grass conversion efficiency. So the better body condition, generally speaking, the more efficient that animal is in converting grass. It's got a healthy immune system because it's got a good body condition. I've experienced that in terms of tick-borne diseases. When my cattle had very good body condition, they didn't get tick-borne diseases. Once they were stressed, they started getting tick-borne diseases. So body condition is extremely important for the immune system. Thirdly, the requirement for high fertility is essential, good body condition. Without body condition, cows won't reconceive. And of course, the energy reserve. A drought reserve, energy reserve. If you have a seasonal rainfall area like we have parts of Africa here, we have 4 months of rain and 8 months of dry season, you need a reserve to carry those animals over that period. So hormonal balance plus body condition, inherent body condition, gives you high practical fertility. And that's why we make the difference between academic fertility and practical fertility. We need inherent body condition and hormonal balance. And you will find that in all the African breeds, generally speaking, and in all the Creole breeds. So we have to use those breeds to improve our cattle. Thank you.